I've got some notes here too about the wareroom of the warehouse, where the bodies were buried right after the hanging, primarily, of course, in 1865. They were buried beside the scaffold, and they remained there. In 1867, by 1867, a little picket fence had been put around the graves, and they each had a wooden headboard in order to facilitate, in keeping with the data recorded by the prison officials as to who was buried where. Now, in 1869, the president finally released the bodies. And when he did so, of course, before that, right after the initial hanging, the families, more or less, of the condemned had petitioned for the release of the remains of their family and kinsmen. And of course, the government was adamant at the time, no, you're not going to be able to retrieve them now, perhaps later, but not now. So the bodies remained there, buried in the prison yard. Like I said, in 67, they erected this nice little white prison fence. I've got some interesting things about the bodies and about the bottles. Most people assume, of course, there were bottles with the prisoners' names on them placed in the coffins upon their burial. People assumed it was the names. Well, I found a newspaper article that described that it wasn't just the names on that slip of paper put in the vial, but they had also put the date of the execution, what they were executed for, and the nature of their crime. All of this went on a piece of paper, put in a glass vial, which was contained in the coffin. When Powell's body was exhumed in 1870, they found his body, the bones, and of course the vial was still there. They said that insects had eaten through the cork and eaten the paper that was contained in the glass vial. What happened to the vial, I don't know. It's probably still with his remains, which are, we think, located in Rock Creek. We're not sure. After Booth's death, it was facilitated that, or thought that Booth, according to Baker, had buried Booth's body at the bottom of the Potomac. We all know that's a myth. Mr. Booth was taken, as John and Barry had stated, to the warehouse, or to the arsenal. It's put in a small cottage temporarily, and then the body was taken into the Wardroom 1, or the warehouse, and buried beneath the flagstones. And I have a description of that room here. Now, if you've ever read anything by George Alfred Townsend, a very noted reporter of the day, he kind of gets kind of flowery in his prose, and sometimes you can't believe everything he writes because he liked to exaggerate, and he liked to exaggerate a lot. I found this article recently by Mr. Townsend, and here he describes that upon entering into the warehouse, we found that before the varied contents of the long room stretching ahead, it could be scanned, but a short turn to the left brought us to the side room, under the floor of which was first buried Booth, and subsequently the rest of the conspirators, and yet more subsequently Captain Wirtz, the Andersonville jailer. The room is a rectangle about 40 by 20 feet, and about 20 feet high also. It is lined with shelves running up and across so as to form many square pigeonholes which are filled with all manner of articles. Right in the center of the room, the ordinary flagstone flooring had been taken up, and the gaps left by the disinterment of Mrs. Surratt on Monday last, and of Harold on Saturday night, had not been filled up. The earth was heaped high on both sides. A single trench, 5 feet deep, 15 feet long, and 6 feet wide, has held the ugly boxes which contained in order Mrs. Surratt, Captain Wirtz, Lewis Powell, alias Payne, George Atzerodt, David E. Harold, and John Wilkes Booth. Mrs. Surratt's disinterment left the boxes holding Wirtz and Payne and Atzerodt quite visible. Harold's exhumation last night, of which herefore would have revealed the box holding Booth, had not been covered up immediately afterwards. So that gives us a pretty good description of what basically the room or the warehouse looked like where the bodies were contained. Now, as I said, Andrew Johnson, president, released the bodies in 1869. Right away there was application for the return of the bodies. Mrs. Surratt's body was first. Of course, Booth's body was also claimed. Booth was taken by the firm here in Washington of Harvey and Marr. He was taken there to be prepared by burial, and thanks to Dave Taylor, found this wonderful graphic called The Day's Doings, which shows a rather strange-looking, almost zombie-like Booth being removed from the warehouse. He was then taken and given in turn to the firm of Jacob Wheeler in Baltimore, who worked with his family to have him interred in an unnamed plot. It was in the Booth family plot. In other words, he's buried there, but his site is not marked. Mrs. Surratt's body was claimed by her daughter Anna, who was at the time engaged to Professor Tonnery, William Tonnery, and he worked for the government. She was buried in Mount Olivet. David Harrell's body was taken up almost immediately after Mrs. Surratt's, and the undertaker who was in charge of his body was none other than Mr. Joseph Gawler. More about Mr. Gawler later. He was buried in a fine walnut coffin ornamented with silver handles and screws, and it was supposed to be quite a very nice coffin. His body today rests between that of two of his sisters. It too is unmarked. Atzerodt, we first thought, and again this is wonderful research from Mr. Dave Taylor, we first thought Atzerodt was buried in Glenwood Cemetery. We thought that for years. Well, we find out that his brother John, who was a detective with the Washington Department, the police department here, he had acquired the permission to retrieve the body along with that of his mother Victoria. They got the body and it was placed in a temporary holding or holding vault, and from there things get kind of sketchy. We don't know exactly where his body is today. Supposedly his sister had a plot and his brother also had a plot, but we've come to find out that his sister's plot, someone else was buried in that particular place. They thought for a while he was buried at Druid Hill, St. Paul Cemetery. He's not there. So if anybody knows where Mr. Atzerodt is located, we would certainly like to know. Now, things get really interesting with Mr. Powell. As you all know, I'm his biographer, and I have done extensive research on him. Now, of all the bodies claimed, his was the last that was moved because his body went unclaimed. His parents attempted to retrieve his body right after the hanging, of course, given a dead flat no. So his remains were left there. The family in Florida had moved further out into the countryside. They had apparently just given up, decided not to remove the remains at all. And so Powell's body remained there with Wirtz. In 1869, 1870, Mr. Gawler was petitioned by the U.S. government to come quietly into the arsenal, retrieve Powell's body. This was done, so that it was said that not even the guards knew what was going on. Mr. Powell's body was taken to Graceland Cemetery and remained there, we think, for about 10 years. Afterwards, for whatever reason, Mr. Gawler was contacted again. Mr. Gawler removed Powell's body and took it to Holmead Cemetery. Holmead was a cemetery which was discontinued in the 80s and 90s because it was causing problems with water in the residences and houses around the area, plus there was a very bad smell. We don't want to like to think about what was probably getting into people's drinking water. So the cemetery, the bodies were all dug up and exhumed. Now things get kind of interesting. Mr. Gawler decided at this time, we know Mr. Gawler did this, we don't know why, removed Mr. Powell's head. He kept the skull, or he gave it to the Army Medical Museum, which at the time was housed where at? Ford's Theater. Mr. Powell was in residence at the time with John Wilkes Booth's thorax and vertebrae, which was removed during the autopsy. We do know that it was given in 1885 to the Smithsonian. Now, accordingly, it was simply listed, the skull. You see the article there. Again, thanks to Mr. Taylor for finding the record book. It says simply skull of a white male. P, no name, just P. It hung, being hanged, at Washington, D.C. for the attempted assassination of Secretary of State William H. Seward in April of 1865. Now, Mr. Powell remains there from January of 1885 until, gee, I wonder who those two people are over there on the end, until January of 1992. The anthropologist at the Smithsonian, Stuart Speaker, is going through Native American skulls to return them to their respective tribes for burial. When lo and behold, he's like, ooh, this one's different. He pulls the papers, and lo and behold, it's none other than our friend, Mr. Powell. He contacted Mike and Mr. James O. Hall, and they contacted us. I received a frantic phone call from Lori Verge one January evening. Betty, are you sitting down? I said, yeah, why? What's going on? I've got news for you. We found Lewis Powell. Well, I was absolutely flabbergasted. What was really interesting was the fact that not many people get to meet the subject of their biography face to face after hundreds of years, or 100 years or so. We were allowed to go in, photograph the body, look at it, the skull, rather, the remains, photograph it, look at it, and we're like, this is pretty neat, but how did he break his jaw? Mike contacted the Powell family in Florida, who confirmed that when he was 12 years old, Powell was kicked in the face by a mule. He broke his jaw and lost one of his molars. The FBI also got involved to confirm the remains by superimposing the skull over Powell's photographs. They look pretty good. I think they match pretty good. What's even more creepy are the numbers on Powell's forehead. You stamp 2244. You put a 4 in front of that, that's his birth date. He was born on April 22nd, 1844. I don't know if that was done deliberately or not. In November of 1994, Powell finally came to rest at his Florida home that he had left 107 years in 1861 to enter the Army, and had never returned, of course, until this particular date in November of 94, Veterans Day, when he was buried at the feet of his mother and in Geneva, Florida, small cemetery there. That's where he resides today. So the whole thing pretty much came full circle. Thanks to Mr. Gawler, we do now have at least a little bit of Powell. We know where he rests. We also pretty much believe that he was buried. The rest of his remains are at Rock Creek. I did some extensive research there a couple of summers ago. A lot of the bodies buried at Holmead were exhumed by Mr. Gawler and just buried rather in a very large mass grave section of Rock Creek in Section K in lots 21, 22, and 23. There is no identification. It just says exhumed and buried by Gawler. And so all of these graves which were exhumed from Homey, we think part of Lewis Powell is probably buried there. There's no record, but that's probably as pretty close as we're going to get it. Okay? Thank you a lot, folks.